I have found a very important but very obscure story that not only is a warning by itself, but it illustrates very clearly the lie being told about Venezuela. Now, the big lie that we're referring to, of course, is that it's a quote-unquote failed socialist state, and it's the result of evil socialism, and it always happens, fails every time it's tried. All that bullshit lie. But it also reveals the false story about the starvation and what else is really going on in the world that you need to know about. Now, we're going to start here with the food safety news, believe it or not. Fresh imported crab meat blamed for multi-state Vibrio outbreak. Well, let's read this. Fresh crab meat, which surprisingly is still being exported from the quote-unquote failed socialist state of Venezuela, has sickened 12 people in 3 states and the District of Columbia with Vibrio parahemolyticus infections. 4 of the ill have required hospitalization. The reason that the fresh crab meat exports are at least somewhat of a surprise is that most Venezuelan fishermen report they are surviving only because of a barter economy has replaced cash sales in a country. Blah, blah, blah. Bullshit busted. Now, tell me this, kids. If you're a Venezuelan fisherman and you have a choice between just going back into shore and taking your catch and selling it to the mass throngs of hungry, starved people who are ready to hand over any amount of wealth just for one crumb or morsel, would you do that? So, no, sorry, these are destined for the U.S. I'm just gonna go ahead and put these in this box over here and have one of you guys drive it over here and ship it off. Yeah, tell me another one. Now, before anyone goes off on the, well, clearly it's from this horrible state of affairs down there that they just can't even keep things from rotting. And, well, the idea that food would rot, number one, by itself, should tell you something huge. But what this really is about the U.S. trying to hide a lie. And they can't hide this one because it has to do with the CDC, and they've got to get the word out about this. That imported crab meat from Venezuela might have this Vibrio in it. Now, Vibrio, strangely enough, we'll go down here. Someone outs this here in the comments, does a very good job. Vibrios are ubiquitous in warm marine waters and result from human waste contamination of the water. We are our own worst enemy. Fecal waste sewage discharges from ships, discharges from sewage waste plants, and runoff from streets are here defined as points of contamination and concentration in shellfish. It is not related to the giant air quotes, the failed socialist state of Venezuela. This is a hyperpolitical jab. Surprise, this FSN has lowered itself to posting. Since the incidence of these sicknesses and clusters of outbreaks are increasing as the world's ocean waters are warming, don't feel comfy at all that this can't occur in the good old USA. Contamination of seafood by pathogens with a human reservoir can occur when growing areas are contaminated with human sewage. That would be something also to consider in a shit hits the fan scenario without any sewage systems working, going and running down to the local stream or down to the local lake and fishing for a living. Yeah, no, not a good idea at all. But you can read this Food Safety Network if you want to. www, of course, to cut Food Safety Networks, /2018/7, fresh imported crab meat blamed for multi-state Vibrio. I think you guys can get there on your own. Now, what else does it prove? Well, let's see. Here's the places that we see the outbreaks, mostly Maryland, D.C., and Pennsylvania. Wow, imagine that. The folks in Washington, D.C. are importing crab meat from Venezuela while telling the rest of the world that the country is starving. That's interesting. Speaking of that failed socialist state, let me bring another point up on that. Now, we've covered this. We've showed you that July 10th, as reported by the Hellenic Shipping News, that U.S. East Coast residual fuel oil production was down, and the first 4 months of this year, the imports from Venezuela have doubled. So that's an interesting fact they don't like you to know. But here's where things really get sideways about this whole failed socialist state thing. So the U.S. is the top buyer of Venezuelan oil, but Washington buys 6 times as much oil from Canada. So what you see here is this is a representation of how big of a customer the U.S. is. Like, for example, Canada, 98% of their oil exports go to the United States, whereas down here in Brazil, only 16% of their total exports go to the United States. So you look at this, and you're like, whoa, see there, McKee? Totally wrong. Look how much better Canada's doing than Venezuela. That'll teach you about socialism. They suck. Wait a minute. Canada? Really? That's interesting. Top 10 most socialist countries in the world. Let's look at all of these failed states, shall we? China. Yeah, they're a failed state, owning most of our debt. Denmark, Finland, Netherlands. Oh, look. The failed socialist state of Canada. Sweden, Norway, Ireland, New Zealand, and Belgium in that order. Yeah. Okay. Tell me another one about this failed socialist state of Venezuela, and that it's not some other story, maybe? Meanwhile, in this failed socialist state, they are arming to the teeth, ready for war right now. It is on the brink of a complete, flat-out shooting war between 2 different parties down there. The Russians backing the Venezuelans, of course, and the globalists backing Colombia. Meanwhile, in this so-called failed socialist state, we have a vice president of the country that is telling, literally, the people of the country, you know what? Government is not your answer. If you have a problem out there, you fix it for yourself. Imagine that. Imagine if we would have a leader in this country say something like that. That maybe if the people of Georgia want to have one solution for a problem, that we should honor that. People of California another, people of Michigan yet even a third, and perhaps even the folks in Kansas have a fourth solution. That's what's being said here in this terrible, horrible socialist state of Venezuela. So, while the Venezuelans are exporting food to the United States, and people are getting sick from it, not because they've done anything wrong, but just because sometimes things happen like this. It has really nothing to do with anything going on in Venezuela. It was just, they don't give crabs a full-up physical before they ship them off. And Vibrio is, like the guy said, can be anywhere. And sewage is a concern. Now, you would have to ask yourself a question. If there is a mass sewage problem somewhere near where they're getting these crabs, well, there's something that causes sewage, and that's food in a certain state, having been eaten and gotten rid of. So, that's interesting. I thought everybody was starving. I thought nobody was eating. And of course, when you eat very little, or barely enough to survive, you don't have excess sewage problems. And we'll just leave it there without being gross. So, the folks in Washington just got busted. They just got outed with their little lie. Now, apparently there's a couple of outliers down here in Louisiana. I would have to assume that more than likely this food being imported from Venezuela probably got down here too. So, I think we'll leave it there. We have enough evidence now to clearly show that the issue that happened in Venezuela was a coordinated strike to take down the Venezuelan export industry so that the U.S. could step up and take those customers and enrich themselves instead. If you want to look up something that is being reported literally side by side right now, look up how U.S. exports to India, oil exports, are soaring while Venezuelan exports to India are cratering. Literally, one specific customer the U.S. just stepped in and took. And by the U.S., I mean U.S. oil companies. And we will leave it there. So I guess this giant failed socialist state here of Canada, they must be next, given the 1,400 million barrels of oil that they send us. Must be just some outlier. Anyway, we will leave it there. Like, share, subscribe.